Hola expats! In video 13, we'll be discussing the security with traveling into Mexico City. The issue of security in Mexico is given extensive attention, much of it's focused on the high levels of violence stemming from the fight between the Mexican government and organized crime. This conflict widely referred to as the drug war, routinely featured in the news media with explosive headlines accompanying graphic images of dead and wounded, as well as an increasingly armed security forces. The media coverage of the issue at times similarly to the ongoing armed conflicts in the world, like those in Iraq and Afghanistan, which make many worry about the prospect of a civil war in the country often referred to as the U.S. backyard, as well as the site for significant foreign investment and business travel. Late last year, the international SOS published its Duty of Care and Travel Risk Management Global Benchmarking Study. One of the key findings revealed how 718 respondents from 60 countries perceived risks of various countries where they do business. In fact, Mexico rated number 1 in the survey, ahead of the places like Iraq and other locations in the Middle East and Africa. The top 5 were rounded out by Nigeria, Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan. Fear of being targeted by violence or the misfortune of being caught in the midst is discussed in war rooms and living rooms alike, with particular concern for those companies that operate in and travelers going to Mexico. The gravity of the conflict cannot be understated, or the effects of the country's overall security environment ignored. However, a degree of nuisance in understanding the threat, as well as the likelihood of suffering in an unfortunate event, is critical at this stage. In reality, suffering through holdups on the street, personal robberies in hotels, or at worst carjackings are much more likely scenario for travelers than the violence being discussed around the office. This nuisance is necessary not only to ensure misguided fears, but to concentrate on the most common risks faced by travelers and to prevent potential harm. In essence, fear of violence stemming from the drug war puts travelers at higher risk of suffering an unfortunate incident because it might blind us from the risk directly in front of us. The following are three key misconceptions about the current security environment which affect travelers and their companies' perception of the threat. The number 1 misconception is the drug war is all-encompassing. This stems from the belief that Mexico as a whole is affected by drug violence both in terms of the affected population and geographically. This assertion is wrong in 2 major ways. And then we have the 2, which is number 1 is the victims. The drug war that we speak of today is which the government of the President Felipe Calderón has sent security forces, including the Army, Navy, and Federal Police, to various hotspots across the country. Began the earnest at the beginning of his term in December of 2006. The total number of homicide victims presumed to stem directly from the conflict since December 2006 stands at 46,000 people, according to the official figures. But most journalistic sources put the number at 50,000. This is an astronomical number of deaths, but the statistics mask 2 important factors. First, that the great majority of victims are either presumed to be involved in the drug trade or a part of the security forces. Less than 10% of the victims are considered to be innocent civilians. The government officially puts this number at 3%. Of this percentage, the number of the innocent foreigners is considered At this percentage, the number of innocent foreigners is considered negligible. Second, Mexico is a populous country of 114 million people. In recent UN estimates, the country to have a murder rate of 18 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. For comparison, Honduras has a murder rate of 86 deaths per 100,000 residents, Venezuela has 67, and Brazil has 25. Therefore, both the number of victims and likelihood of a foreigner being affected when put into a significant context is low. The geographical spread. Although a substantial number of states in Mexico have seen important levels of drug-related homicides and armed confrontations, these do not represent a majority of the territory. The northern border states of Baja California and others include the brunt of the violence in the past 6 years. The western states are a part of the marijuana and heroin production zone, historically known as Mexico's Golden Triangle, are also affected. Most recently, the southwestern states of Mexico, or on Mexico's Gulf Coast, have exhibited important levels of violence. While these 10 represent an impressive number of states, the country has 31 such entities in addition to Mexico City, which is the federal district. Even within the aforementioned areas, not all cities are affected. A clear example is in the city of Juarez, has concentrated between 10% and 20% of the total number of homicides in the country as a whole. Now, misconception number 2. Dangers have risen in new areas and have fallen in the usual hot zones. The severity of the drug violence and the increasing number of affected areas dominate international media headlines, leading to the additional problems in the perception of the threat of the environment posed to travelers in the city that they visit the most. As the public becomes accustomed to the stories of the confrontations and executions in places such as Juarez, the media has moved on to a more eye-catching story: the rise of violence in peaceful parts of Mexico. While the fact is that serious problems face formerly benign environments, it does not, however, mean that the traveler should be unconcerned about places that are home to the usual suspects of insecurity. Notorious acts of violence in the wealthy and industrial city of Monterrey in northern Mexico has centered extreme worry. Frequent illegal roadblocks by drug gangs as the means to assert territorial controls have been used with alarming frequency. Most notably, daytime shootings and fire bombings of an upscale casino, which resulted in 53 deaths, have led to the significant drop in this travel to the city. Most international companies have begun to reevaluate activities in the city which have once deemed one of the country's safest. Such reviewed threat assessments are undeniably necessary when confronted by a rapidly changing security environment. However, the danger of such a reassessment lies in the comparable lifting of precautionary security measures in places where threats persist but may not command local news headlines. Let's see. Local governments are trying to shift this perception. Have frequently allowed the myth to continue and also contribute to it. Authorities claim that both cities are more secure because shootouts and executions, the hallmark of organized crime, are rare. Although it is true that these crimes have gone to a much lower incidence in Mexico City, Mexico City has far from exempt from Mexico's security problems. In fact, a classic concern expressed kidnapping shows signs of being on the rise in both areas. Misconception number 3. Mexican organized crime is more dangerous to the visitor than the common crime. As we are bombarded by gruesome pictures of the dead and tallies of their numbers, the old worries surrounding traveler and expat security in Mexico has begun to fade. The menace of being targeted by a cartel attack or being caught in the midst of this concerns about kidnapping, which is so predominantly featured in news about Mexican security environment before 2006. Although a long-term kidnap for ransom has never been threatened to to visitors to Mexico the same way it did in other countries like Colombia in the late 90s and early 2000s, the threat of express kidnapping and that of the same period featured as a top concern. Express kidnapping, which is a crime to carjacking in which the victim is taken along with the vehicle and forced to retrieve money from a bank or an ATM, begun as a real threat in Mexico and has since spread across Latin America, most notably Venezuela. The fact that the victim is seldom targeted, as in the case of any long-term kidnapping for ransom, and more often attacked because the opportunity arises, making the crime one which requires less prior planning and skill. And this is such that a crime of a common crime and not organized in the kind that penetrates from it. At least to the observer, if not the victim, express kidnapping seems less menacing than a cartel shootout or a long projected kidnap for ransom, but this view ignores two major factors. First, the likelihood of being caught in the midst of a shootout or being kidnapped by an organized crime group is significantly smaller than than suffering from a street holdup, carjacking, or express kidnapping. Second, the danger of life posed by common criminal to his victim is actually higher than that of the shootout or kidnap for ransom. The aim of holdup or carjacking is an immediate reward which does not depend on the survival of the victim. Kidnap for ransom inherently depends on the return of the victim to his family and alive. One must assume that less experienced perpetrator is likely younger, nervous due to the personal danger and poor planning and potentially under the influence of drugs and alcohol. The action perpetuated by the common criminal is thus more likely to incur loss of life or injury, particularly if the victim attempts to resist. These facts are still remained in Mexico and are more likely to affect the visitor regardless of the more eye-catching perceived dangers of the drug war. And now to dispel these myths. Mexico's present environment of worsening security conditions is undeniable. Its complexity often results in confusion and fear among the foreign visiting population. A degree of rational analysis is necessary for companies sending travelers to Mexico. The same applies to travelers in order to dispel the misconceptions that have developed out of the problem. Careful considerations are critical to ensure the right kind of prior preparation before travel. Correcting the mistakes that I talked about previous are essential to an expat's security and the first step in developing a smart travel strategy of the company of the individual level before going to Mexico City. And that concludes our videos on expats. Sorry about the lights. I don't know what happened. I think something happened in the room. Anyway, thank you for watching, and remember, any questions and concerns can be answered through the hyperlinks in the description. Thank you. Good luck on your travels.